Well, good afternoon, everyone. We would like to welcome Professor Chatterjee. El doctor Chatterjee se formó en la Universidad de Cambridge y en la Universidad de Londres. Actualmente es profesor de comercio internacional y derecho en la London Metropolitan University. Ha sido autor de diversas publicaciones y una veintena de libros, entre los que se dedican Legal Aspects of Trade Finance, 2007, Law of International Business, 2012. Actualmente es Senior Associate Fellow at Warwick University and Associate Fellow in the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies en la Universidad de Londres. Sigue siendo también Visiting Professorial Fellow at Queen Mary University of London. No quiero extenderme mucho porque esto es muy largo, pero tengan la certeza que el doctor Chatterjee tiene una amplia experiencia en programas de desarrollo, tanto en el área de negocios como en el de derecho. También posee una extensa experiencia en el sector público y privado de la educación en el Reino Unido.
Good afternoon, friends. Thank you, Professor Bonilla, for your kind words about me. And I also convey my thanks to the university for inviting me to give this lecture. I apologize that I'm unable to give my lecture in the Spanish language, and I have promised myself that I'll learn it, a bit of it, by the next year if I'm here. I wear too many hats. I understood most of what Professor Bonilla said about me. Recently, I have been a director of the London Academy of Diplomacy, which is the only institution in the United Kingdom. We train practicing diplomats. Our students are ambassadors and diplomats, plus those of the students who wish to pursue the career of diplomacy. The reason why I chose emerging markets and diplomacy as a topic is based on my experience when I teach diplomats. I'm a lawyer by training. I did business studies, but I teach as a law professor at the University of London and Warwick. But I was invited to assume this position, and it is a learning process, a curve I'm going through. I have my own diplomatic background, and that helps me a lot. I have noticed that traditional diplomats are taking too much time to accept the new members of the emerging markets, that a new kind of knowledge in diplomacy is needed. That urgency is lacking. And I thought that I would exploit this opportunity to explain to you and share my ideas with you that it is important for us to accept the role that the three countries in particular are playing, at least for the last 10 years or so. By nature, I'm a very controversial teacher and lawyer. The controversy we were taught at universities, nothing is straight. So you'll find my discussion this afternoon rather controversial. In the form of introduction, I want to say that the emerging economies, there will be even more than three in a matter of another 5 years or so, if not earlier. The emerging economies, particularly in Asia and Latin America, that is Brazil, China and India, are now prepared to compete with the traditional players on the world trade and investment markets. I mentioned on purpose the words traditional players. That is the crux of my expose this afternoon, that the transformation process from traditional to modern, with which concept I'd like to conclude my expose this afternoon, that emerging markets are going through a kind of transformation process also, that is, whether they would go through westernization or modernization. And I can see that diplomacy has to go through a similar process too. The advent of these new players, that is, in alphabetical order, Brazil, China, and India, would require the traditional players to review their international business strategies. And that, to me, is a difficult task to perform, because after the age of 5, human beings have difficulties in shifting from one idea to another. And imagine the perception that traditional players had for such a long time, and the switching over from that traditional perception to the new perception and the learning process they have to go through is not an easy one. Therefore, I repeat my point that traditional players are now required to critically examine the trade and investment strategies of the emerging economies. One must assume that they were backward countries, they're coming up. And I'm going to offend many of you by drawing analogies with the colonial powers, that what they did or they did not, and what has the long-term effect of colonization, which is still prevailing in my opinion. I therefore want to emphasize that the traditional players should not have any prejudice. I'm not suggesting they have, but they should not have, against the emerging economies, that they will not be able to compete with the traditional players. China, like India, are investing in the manufacturing, service, as well as a very important sector, that is the natural resources sector. And they have already established their competitive edge. They can compete in certain chosen sectors. I mean, I remember about 10 years ago, must be 12, 13 years ago, British government invited government of India to develop their IT system. I was there on that occasion when the negotiation took place and the contract was signed. That gave me an idea that a country with a high degree of intellectual ideas, with determination, through indigenous efforts, their own efforts, they can be as good as others. And indeed, IT is being developed there with the help of Indian experts. In a country such as Britain, which has traditionally been famous for being an inventive country. Economic diplomacy is in ordinary English, is the buzzword. In my book on diplomacy, I mentioned it, that without economic diplomacy, without your economic independence, your political independence is meaningless. And therefore, in my opinion, time has now arrived for everybody to understand the new dimensions to economic diplomacy. The players are going to be different. Traditional players are more advanced than the emerging players there. But it is a market, is a hybrid market now. You cannot have any monopoly in any particular area unless you give me very unique areas, aircraft, shipbuilding, that will also come up, in which they will have their expertise in a matter of time now. At this point, I want to do a kind of empirical study that should we really put Brazil, China, and India in the same bag? Each of these economies, and this is where it becomes interesting to study the countries individually. One should not say China, India, Brazil in one go, because the characteristics are different there, although they have come to the same platform. There are some common characteristics between these three countries. Namely, they all are primarily agricultural economies with emerging industrial infrastructure. Think about Britain. Britain is first an agricultural country. It takes pride in many things, but I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that per hectare production, agriculture production in the world is highest in Britain. But Britain opted for industry because Britain is self-sufficient agriculture, and if necessary, they're prepared to buy agricultural stuff from others also because industry is their main hub, if you like. In all these countries, industries are labor-intensive in Brazil, China, and India. And level of skills is not as high, generally speaking, other than their chosen areas. Furthermore, the financial infrastructure need to be well regulated. And I'm telling them whenever opportunities arise through my publications or whatever, that you must develop your insurance and banking sectors as soon as possible. And that each of these economies has good small-scale industry, that is handicrafts and other small industries. But the problem is, in each of these countries, and particularly in China and India, education is primarily addressed to elitists, the higher echelon people. And India should make secondary education compulsory and free because it is quite a rich country. I can tell you that I've been living in England since I was 16 or 17, 16 must be. I do not use my Cambridge accent because that is pompous. So I'm just, in the courtroom I do. But as long as people understand me. Am I clear to everybody? Yes. Right. You have to understand that if education doesn't become all-pervasive, then the country will have difficulties. And that is the primary difficulty when I go to developing countries as an expert to develop their capacities. I can see that these people are clever. The intelligence is there, but the opportunities are not there. And India has to make secondary education compulsory and free for everybody. We have no problems there about higher education. Rich people will go, and there are many scientists, doctors. Professor Hernandez was in that part of the world. He will confirm that India has never been short of scientists, doctors, engineers, lawyers, but is limited to elitist people, which is not the right thing to do. And you find that same characteristics in China too. The reason for my mentioning this issue is simple. Imagine now if education becomes all-pervasive, is open to everybody, free of charge. What kind of intellectuals and the reservoir of intelligent people will be there? And people are not thinking along those lines. They are not thinking along those lines because of bad political policies. The intellectuals are not living in their mother countries, they are abroad. Imagine that if an educational boom takes place, what will happen then? I now want to give you the basics because we guys lawyers, you are also, many of your students here, you have to justify whatever you say. My information comes from the World Bank. That information one should not question, although we criticize them constantly and consistently. Brazil is the world's 7th wealthiest economy. Is important, 7th. The gross domestic product, the GDP, in 2012, because that is the latest figure I could get, was US dollars 2,223 trillion, a staggering figure in fact. And GDP rose from 7.5% in 2011 and 2012. There was a depressive period, but they are now coming back again. I'm familiar with the fact that Brazil has socio-economic problems, and World Bank, to cut short my lecture, I have got all the details here, the kind of programs that World Bank has initiated to bring about changes within the society and also in the economic arena too. And the effect of it has already become manifest, is clear to everybody, you can see it. Brazil, incidentally, of these three countries, has very high level of foreign currency reserves, about 380 billion US dollars. The reason why I chose to mention that, I am the example. Fortunately, I come from a very wealthy family because of my father, who is a very eminent lawyer. But when I landed in the UK, I landed with £1. You have to trust, believe me. The reason is the central bank would not give us foreign exchange. And it's very serious. Now, universities are full of Indian students because the Reserve Bank, which is central bank, take money, no problems. Because the reserve is very high. It's very high. I had to struggle for the first 7 years, I remember, to get somewhere in my education. But I'm grateful to my parents for what they did to me, forever. The 380 billion reserves, which is increasing, cannot be forgotten because that reserve will be utilized in various sectors, starting with education and industry, of course. In 2012, only 2 years ago or so, the government of Brazil launched a range of initiatives with a view to reducing energy costs, strengthening investment, strengthening infrastructure, encouraging foreign participation, that is of industries, and also poverty eradication, which is very, very important. And World Bank, in partnership with the government, has a plan now, economic development plan, for 3-year period, 2012 to 2015, with a guaranteed money from the World Bank, $5.8 billion, with a view to strengthening the public and private investment, regional and territorial development, and improve service delivery to the poor, and management of natural resources. And I keep telling everybody that this sector should not be disregarded. You must know that World Bank over the last, as from 2002, invested in various developing countries with a view to exploring natural resources, and they have succeeded in 20 developing countries. Bangladesh has now the largest gas deposit in the world. Imagine what is going to happen if they develop and implement a creative policy to exploit the resources there. In September 2013, last year, World Bank financed 82 active projects in Brazil. And they are very careful about the kind of social problems Brazil has. To eradicate that, that will take time, but the process has already started. And I can bore you with other information that in Rio de Janeiro, the Metropolitan Urban and Housing Development Project, Minas Partnership and Development Program, there are about 10 such programs is going on in Brazil at this moment of time. Insofar as China is concerned, the reform started in 1978, but that reform was not remarkable. I was in China in February this year, and the government authorities told me that they're getting there, but still not there. That means the old council still dominates the political and economic policies. And to be honest with you, the WTO membership of China, which took 24 years to get to this stage, to the minimum level of achievement for accession, that has to be looked into again, that whether China is really up to the level of other countries, member countries of WTO. They're still working on that in a very intensive fashion there. Interesting enough, before I come to India, strangely enough, all these three countries, Brazil, China and India, remain as developing countries because of the fact that these countries have borrowed a significant amount of loans from the World Bank. And you must know that if a country borrows money from the World Bank, it has to be designated as a developing country. But these countries' per capita income and the foreign exchange reserves are remarkably high. There must be a kind of joint diplomacy between these three countries to convince the World Bank group, because there are about 7 institutions under it, that the potentials are there and they would be able to return the money on time. In fact, India borrowed the largest amount of extended standby from the IMF for 3 years for development of her energy sector, and India returned the money absolutely on time, with interest thereon. I'm trying to give you a scenario to see that what kind of things are happening. But they will take time to compete with the Western world, because by the time they come to the level of the Western world might be there. But who knows the way they are marching on and on. China currently is going through a 5-year plan, which is due to end in 2015. It has addressed several issues, that is, prioritization has taken place. I can give you the basics, that the areas that they have chosen, and under each of these subheadings there are subheadings also. Support for a greener growth, basically agricultural country. Promotion for inclusive development, that is indigenous development, enhancing opportunities for the youth, and advancement of mutually beneficial relations. Now, this is important. If you take yourself back to the colonial days, there was no such concept as mutually beneficial development. And therefore, if you study the investment policies of developing countries in general, they are now looking for what I call balancing of interests. You cannot come and exploit our resources without giving us training, without taking us on your management. Is not possible anymore. You have to share the profits. You have to plow back some of it into the economy there. So these changes are important, and you need, the way I started, diplomats need a different kind of negotiation skills, because World Bank must have been convinced by these governments as to their potentials. And indeed, I have not heard of any default as yet that they have failed to return their money there. And the bank in China has been encouraging China to eradicate poverty, particularly in the areas in which poverty is rife, that is your southern China there. Then China is paying much attention to the green project, so that from agricultural point of view, self-sufficiency is achieved. I now want to give you a list of projects that China has been engaged with the help of World Bank. In fact, it is a joint program with World Bank. They are. I'm not going to give you the long list, but a few examples. Rural communities development, which covers many, many areas. Renewable energy development project, that means waste management. Forestry development, then of course education there, and I think they are now in the process of changing postgraduate education system, because I was asked to hold seminars when I was in the government on certain subjects which we teach in the United Kingdom, and you also will be taught, such as investment, corporate finance, corporate governance, international organizations, the important subjects at a postgraduate level. They are operating them now. Coming to India now is the world's fourth largest economy. And I want to tell you that the geographic area of a country can be an asset. So in Latin America, who is going to beat Brazil? Geographically, the area is such. Like Sudan, before Sudan was divided, was the largest country in Africa there. Since 1947, that is when India attained her independence, the government in 1974 brought about a landmark agricultural revolution, whereby India is now a major food exporter. And it's very interesting. The country effectively, virtually has two seasons now, summer and monsoon. 6 seasons, we cannot find it anymore there. During the monsoon time, they preserve water. During the summertime, pumps, they sprinkle water for agriculture in a primitive fashion. And if you see the textile factories there, I can tell you that many of you are wearing their textile products. You'll be horrified, but quality is good. That's what is needed. Through indigenous efforts there, they have done it. I want to establish one of my points, that emerging markets, and I entirely support UN report on this, that do not try to acquire too many technologies. You develop them, it will take you time. I was thinking of it the other day that the United States took 50 years for economic takeoff. Sweden took 150 years for economic takeoff. India took 60 years for economic takeoff, with all her problems, domestic problems, which are being sorted out by the political authorities now. India has strengths in particular in the following industries: pharmaceuticals, steel, information industry, agriculture of course, then automobile, and also you'll find that other day-to-day technologies that we need, India is now able to manufacture them and export them too. It has, the country has the largest export markets in the Middle East and Africa. But poverty remains a critical problem for India to resolve. To a certain extent, if you live in India, you'll be able to agree with me that poverty is kept alive by people because maybe they want to avoid payment of taxes or a second source of income. It is a part of their life, it seems to me now. But I told Professor Hernandez day before yesterday that when I go to India to visit on business, because unfortunately I lost my parents, so my reason for going there is that much now. It is very expensive country. The cost of living is as high as we have in London. And as you know, London is one of the most expensive towns in the world. It is worth seeing that how much money they have. And if I were a student now, I would have gone back to India because of the attractive salary package you get. It goes up to between 6 lakhs to 10 lakhs, which is the denomination of the currency, which means that it is extremely good salary with chauffeur-driven car and accommodation, everything there for qualified people. The country's infrastructure needs considerable amount of work. They are doing now, and they are now between 2013 and 2017, they have adopted programs with World Bank again, the similarities between Brazil and China, and the areas they have given or have decided to give emphasis to would be integration, that is infrastructural development throughout the whole country, rural and urban transformation. It is typical of developing countries. Everybody wants to live in the main capital city, which is also the case in London. Everybody wants to live in London there. But they are trying to disperse people to other parts of the country so that rural development take place. By the way, they have a huge infrastructure now on distance learning system. I want to give you the following comments without... Have I exceeded my time? 10 minutes. 10 minutes, I complete a book. Right. I want to tell you that, which I've already mentioned to you, but I want to reiterate that Victorian England, that is the England which was famous for colonization, I have nothing against them because my idea has been that if the poor countries were rich at that time, they would have done the same thing. So I have no problems with that. But it is true that when colonization was rife, several countries, their own countries were not that developed, but their export income was very good. The clearest example would be Great Britain, these days UK. Great Britain was not internally that rich. So I'm suggesting, my first idea is, are there any correlations between education and industrial development and being an investment partner or an externally rich country? Going back to my analogy with Great Britain, domestically Britain was not that financially strong. I remember when I was a student there, many houses did not have proper bathrooms. The air conditioning system was totally unknown to them. But over the last 30 years, the country has been marching on and on in terms of development also. So even though these countries are poor, still poor, it is quite possible, therefore, to become players on the emerging markets there. So there is no correlation that you have to develop all aspects of infrastructure to become a player on the market there. It's a bad analogy, but that is a fact now. It seems to me that three have done very well without being able to call themselves rich countries. That's the first point. So without all-pervasive education system, economic performance of a country may be improved, which is not the right thing to do, but that is exactly what has happened. The second is that without a full-fledged infrastructure, you can be a good player on the world market, because these three countries, each of them, lacks proper infrastructure too. And political stability, well, India has it. Brazil has social problems. China, I'm not too sure what kind of stability is there, although it's better now. So there's another issue that all correlations which we have learned when we are students, they are falling absolutely flat. But they have paid attention, unlike the colonial powers, to develop their domestic economies. At the same time, it might take them another 50 years to come to the level of the traditional rich countries. I don't know whether you know this name, Vincent Cable, who is now the business secretary of the Liberal Party, lived in England. Very fine Cambridge economist. In one of his books, he said that about China, a few years ago, before China became an effective player on the trade and investment markets, that there is a dormant volcano coming to life. That was predicted by Vincent Cable 10 years before China became a player on the market there. And another man, Madison, he also mentioned about India and China particularly, that it is a case of waiting game. They are bound to come up, and they have indeed come up now. I'm not going to give you Rosto's theory. It seems to me that he was also right about his prediction over these countries there. One point that bothers me is that in all these countries, three countries, there's a common element again, that is cheap labor and cheap raw materials. China's investment policy is now being considered again. That is, China invested in Africa mostly. African countries contested the Chinese policies. And if you go to the Nile area in Sudan, which is a very large country, you'll find an hotel there exclusively meant for Chinese investors. Their presence is so much so conspicuous, is worth mentioning there. But I wonder how long these three emerging countries will be in advantageous position from the point of view of cheap labor and cheap raw materials, because the trade unions, they become international, they will push the governments there, you better observe human rights, you better give them minimum wages, and probably the competitive edge will be a bit narrower there. But by that time, I think that wage level in Germany and UK, I'm not too familiar with the Uruguayan wage structure, I hear various things, but indeed in the UK and Germany the wage level is very, very high. So they'll be even higher there, it seems to me. The emerging economies, they share common elements which I told you, and they are very clever, it seems to me, that they have chosen certain areas in which the traditional players have never been interested. They are exploiting those areas. I cannot give you the role of diplomats because I've already exhausted my allocated time, but I want to mention three things given the time I have. I don't think that these countries should go for westernization. The reason is that by adopting that method, developing countries could not be made developed. They became grounds for experimenting. What are the factors for achieving development? The most important factor must be the indigenous factors there. Develop yourself through your own efforts, because all rich countries in the western part of the world, they did same thing. They did not initially borrow ideas from the neighboring countries, but most of it was done by themselves. Now, cooperation is a common phenomenon. I can see that in Cambridge and German universities and American universities. They are doing collaborative work to invent many new things also. So I think that they should be in the business of modernizing themselves. With their own things, they can be modernized. And if you go to any of these developing countries, I can tell you, the ordinary consumable products, I don't see much difference in between the quality that we find here and the quality that we find there, other than certain daily products there. So in conclusion, I want to say that emerging markets should remain forward-looking and dynamic. They should learn from the old countries, but there should be a degree of cohesion between the rich and the emerging countries, rather than creating gulf between the two sets of countries, because you need sharing of ideas between the rich, the emerging, and the poor. That is one of the best means of developing the economies, best means of achieving my favorite term, socio-economic development. That is how, in a sort of unsatisfactory fashion, I wanted to finish it, or I have finished it.
Is the new development bank from the BRICS going to help the emerging markets to achieve development?
Well, it was established only a few weeks ago. We are waiting to see whether the new development bank will complement the activities of the World Bank Group. As a lawyer, I cannot speculate, but I'm speculating here because I'm in a classroom. My speculation has been that the financial burden of the World Bank might be lessened, minimized to a certain extent, when the new development bank will start lending money. The capital is staggeringly high capital. They can do so, provided the flow of capital is maintained, that is, they replenish what goes out. I think that the analogy that you can draw with would be Asian Development Bank. Asian Development Bank's contribution compared with the contribution made by African Development Bank is remarkably good. And they understood the socio-economic issues in the whole of Asian region there. And I think that new development bank, if it comes to its senses, it will be working alongside Asian Development Bank, so that the World Bank's IDA, the International Development Association, which provides funds to the least developed and developing, although we have no clear-cut definitions of this, it is a good symptom that rather than having a monopoly over lending by two institutions, main bank IBRD and the IDA, the burden will be then distributed within the other banks also. I think there is a good policy, but I have to wait for another 6 months to be able to write on it, that what is happening there. So that's it. But it is a good question, and I think it is worth watching them, what they are after. As a foreigner here, and Professor Hernandez and I have been interested in Mercosur, particularly. We want to see what Mercosur can do. There are two answers to your question, and I'm prepared to be corrected if I'm wrong. One is that if I draw analogies with the Andean Pact, then I feel depressed. But I'm an optimistic guy. If Mercosur adopts a dynamic, forward-looking policy, and disregarding their political differences, then you can have a second EU model, European Union model, although the European Union model is not the best model in the world. I think that Latin America, by studying the geography and the resources, have plenty of resources. And a coordinated, cohesive policy is needed. But it can be done, because you have the expertise. It can be done. But I was delighted that he confirmed, I was very worried about it, that if Brazil joins NAFTA, then you lose a big power. And I'm told that, is that right? Brazil might not join, then it is good, because the resources are there, and each of the countries have their resources. So if you choose your countries properly, it might happen, and they can be good participants. In fact, your question is so valid that because of the lack of participation that much on the world market, Asian countries have covered a good slice of the Latin markets too, which should have been covered by the Latin markets themselves, or Latin manufacturers. That's it. That much I know.
Yes. How do you think corruption is playing in the development process?
3 guys are writing thesis with me on a PhD on this, and I'm telling them you won't get PhD, because it is there. And the World Bank report, my study, quarter of it is full of World Bank reports on poverty and corruption. Is mind-boggling. I don't know what the end of it is. You need a degree of ethics, but here comes a practicing lawyer. You do not teach ethics to business community. It won't work. I don't know the answer, because they are saying, World Bank report, one of the reports suggested clearly that it will be inhuman to tell them not to earn corrupt money, because that is a more definitive income for them to maintain their families, because the main source of income is so low. Frankly, I don't want to give you incorrect answer, because to me there is no answer to it. Therefore, I'm advising my students, because these students are absolutely hell-bent that they must write thesis on this. Now they realize that they will not get anywhere. So I don't know the answer, but it is, we cannot be emotional, but I'm going to use an emotional word. It is an evil. I don't know how to eradicate it, because I tell you why. I was absolutely horrified to see, I won't mention the name of the country, it's not this country, that an applicant wants a loan from a bank, and the bank manager was invited to lunch. And he came to have his lunch with the borrower. That's corruption. Am I clear on this? So that you can find even in the Western world. So one should not say that it is an evil or a disease that has pervaded only the developing world. Of course it is everywhere there. I mean, I was in Cameroon. As a foreigner, I didn't have any difficulties in passing through the security, all the barriers there, and I'm waiting for my friend, a lawyer, to come and join me. The friend was a Cameroonian. They took him, they punished him for half an hour. And then you know what he had to do. Okay, here is the thing. And then he comes to the plane. It's everywhere. It is everywhere. So in Western world I can see the evidence of it. In England we have a called Bribery Act, but it has been addressed to public bodies. I still wonder why it has not been addressed to private bodies, because they think that public bodies must not have any sense, any degree of corruption there, which is 50% of the thing they're dealing with. So there you are. I cannot answer this question, but it's a very good question, difficult question, but I don't want to give you a misleading answer.
By themselves and with their own methods.
Yes, because I don't want any dependency which pervaded us until about the 1980s. Because take more money, aid, a loan, it didn't work. It did not work. And therefore, they turned it around by engaging themselves. And I have been a very ardent supporter of capacity building. That when I go to Africa or Asia through the UNDP, the UN development programs, I can see they're very intelligent. Maybe they don't have the latest IT or whatever, but in terms of thinking process, they are as clever.